Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I am Amy Waywell, Director of Membership at the MFA, and I am delighted that so many of you could join us for tonight's lecture featuring the curatorial team behind the exhibition Georgia O'Keeffe and Henry Moore. As a reminder, this program is coming to you virtually from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Founded in 1870, the MFA stands on a site that has long served as a place of meeting and exchange among different Algonquin nations, including the Massachusetts. As a museum, we acknowledge the long histories of the land we occupy today and seek ways to make Indigenous narratives more prominent in our galleries and programming. Before I introduce our speakers, a few logistical notes for tonight's talk. This lecture is being recorded, and a transcript and closed captions are available during the program. To enable the closed captions, go to the bottom of the Zoom window and click on the button Show Captions. During the presentation, please use Zoom's Q&A function to ask questions and share comments. And now I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Dr. Erica Hirshler is the Croll Senior Curator of American Paintings, Art of the Americas at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. She is particularly interested in the vibrant artistic exchange between the United States and Europe and in issues of national identity, transnationalism, and their implications for artists, as well as in the increasingly available opportunities for women over the course of the long 19th century. Hirshler's most recent exhibition was Fashioned by Sargent, an interdisciplinary project exploring Sargent's portraits, fashion, and the construction of identity. Dr. Hirshler holds a BA from Wellesley College and an MA and PhD from Boston University. Courtney Harris is Assistant Curator of Decorative Arts and Sculpture, Art of Europe at the Museum of Fine Arts. She received her MA from the Courtauld Institute of Art and her BA from Johns Hopkins University. Most recently, at the MFA, she curated the exhibition Tiny Treasures, The Magic of Miniatures in 2023. Her projects over the past decade have included gallery renovation projects, including the French Salon Period Room reinstallation and a new suite of galleries dedicated to Dutch and Flemish art. Thank you both for joining us tonight and sharing this beautiful exhibition with our members.
Thank you so much, Amy, and welcome to everyone. I am delighted to have you attend this virtual lecture. I wish we were together, but tonight I wouldn't wish it on anybody to go outside on this rainy night here in Boston. The exhibition, Georgia O'Keeffe and Henry Moore, will introduce the show to you and also give you a little bit of background about these two important 20th century artists. Two artists and two curators. You'll hear from me and also from Courtney. We co-curated the show from Boston and we'll share this lecture tonight. Could I have the next, please? Georgia O'Keeffe and Henry Moore, who you see here, may not have ever met. They worked in different media on different continents, perhaps, only perhaps, overlapping in New York when they both had solo exhibitions in 1946 at the Museum of Modern Art. But whether they met or not, seeing their work together, we realize that they share a visual conversation, both of them inspired by nature to create abstract works of art. Next, please. The poetry between them was recognized by our colleague Anita Feldman of the San Diego Museum, who organized this show, and you see it here on the left at the outside of the San Diego Museum. San Diego organized the show and produced its accompanying catalog, which you see on the right. The MFA Boston is the fourth and final venue of the show, and as we do, we customized the show for Boston. How did we do that? Let me take you a little bit behind the scenes. Next, please. I saw the show in San Diego in the summer of 2023, and you see the entrance here on the left and one of the galleries here on the right. At that point, we made the decision to bring this beautiful exhibition to the MFA. Next, please. The show was organized quite differently in San Diego. It had different themes and different galleries, but there were some beautiful juxtapositions of O'Keeffe's paintings and Moore's sculpture, like the one you see here, that we knew would also sing for Boston's visitors. Next. We also brought our own knowledge and our own experiences to bear. I went to Ghost Ranch a few years ago, and you see me here standing outside at Ghost Ranch with O'Keeffe's Pedernal Mountain, which she portrayed so often in the background behind me. The MFA team also went to Henry Moore's home and studio just outside of London. And you see us all here at the center where we could experience Moore's work where it was made. And we also went to see the show in Montreal. You see an installation shot here on the right, giving us lots of ideas about what we hope to do with the show once we had it in Boston. Next, please. We also brought our own collections into the mix. Works by O'Keeffe, like the two you see here, both highlights of the MFA's very strong collection of American modernism, and also this head for a study for the UNESCO reclining figure from the MFA's collection. These works hadn't traveled with the exhibition, but we were able to add all our own works for the Boston viewing. Next, please. And we also chose a lot of works by other artists whose achievements would add context to O'Keeffe and Moore's engagement with the natural world and with organic abstraction. This was very much a team project, and we're so grateful to so many across our institution for their enthusiasm about the show and their generous assistance in helping us put it together. Next, please. We had our hands in every aspect of the planning and installation, from deciding where the sculpture should go. And I have to point out Courtney standing before our mock-ups of Moore's sculpture so that we could see how they would look in the galleries and where the paintings would be best displayed behind them. We installed the exhibition, and we even did a little bit of touch-up in the last moments before the preview. I'll hand things over to Courtney.
Thank you so much, Erica. I'll take us through the exhibition in room by room now, and we'll each do a deep dive into Henry Moore first, and then Erica will pick it up again to look at O'Keeffe later. So this is, if you've been to the exhibition, this is the entrance lobby with photographs of both of the artists here. And then you flow right from there into the first gallery. We wanted to really start the exhibition with a knockout pairing by the two artists. And Erica already mentioned how we were able to add works by O'Keeffe. From our own collection, we added 13 works by O'Keeffe to the exhibition, including this painting that you see on the wall here. This is our Red Tree, Yellow Sky. And when we were in the process of planning the exhibition, we saw these two works together and knew that they would become a kind of touchstone for us in this first space. We really wanted to explore right away the way in which O'Keeffe and Moore both found objects in nature and used those as the inspiration for their art. Both artists enjoyed long walks, O'Keeffe in New Mexico where she lived and Henry Moore in Hertfordshire, and they would pick things up as they were walking and bring them back into their studio where they would continue to iterate and use those objects as they created their works of art. And you look at the O'Keeffe painting in the background here, at first you might not know that the object that we're seeing here, it may look like a large tree, but it's actually just a bit of wood that O'Keeffe has held up against the sky. And then that mountain that Erica mentioned, the Pedernal, is there just at the bottom, and the horizon line is quite low. So she's taking something small, holding it against the landscape and juxtaposing it and creating this new view and new vision. Henry Moore, too, starts from something small and creates this sculpture, which is over 5 feet tall. He starts with a small bird bone that he picks up on his walks, He puts a little bit of plasticine on the top, a little bit of clay to create the head of the figure, and then blows it up into this large-scale work made in fiberglass, where you still see that sharpness of the bone there, but you see this beautiful figure sort of turning in space. And I love the way the sensibility of these two works with their dynamism pointing up to the upper right corner. They just sing so beautifully together and really start the show off with a bang. In this first gallery, which has this beautiful, rich, deep orange color on the walls, it also serves as the place where we allow visitors to see a bit of what they might know by O'Keeffe and Moore. O'Keeffe paintings with bones and flowers, the Southwest landscape that where she painted. And for Moore, the thing people might know best are his large-scale bronze works. And here we have a working model size object, so not as large as they get, but the largest we can fit in the galleries. And it too takes inspiration from small-scale objects, from pieces of flint that he found that he arranges into the forms of a vertebra. And I'll just show you that this is on loan to us from the Tate Britain, and we were able to install it with the amazing help of our colleagues at the Henry Moore Foundation, who used this gantry to rig it up into place. It has the distinction of being the heaviest work in the exhibition. Our colleagues also helped us here. You can see another work in motion. Erica showed this just briefly as in her introduction. This is our Barbara Hepworth sculpture on the move from outside of the building, coming into the building for the first time in recent memory, and really becoming a monumental work in the second gallery of the exhibition, which I'll take you into now. Erica mentioned the way in which we added works by other artists to the exhibition. These were not in the other iterations at the other venues, but for us, we felt that there was such a strength, particularly of American modernism, and particularly photography, that we wanted to highlight our own collections. And we added 35 works by other artists to this space, where they're interspersed with works by O'Keeffe and Moore, showing the way in which they were both a part of a through line of organic abstraction in the 20th century, but also somewhat different as well. There's really something quite special about both of them. This is a really lovely grouping here of some photographs by both Edward Weston, the great American photographer, and his son, Brett Weston, also a photographer. The Edward Westons are the two that are hung together, the vertical ones. But you can see in the top one, it's a naturally occurring concretion that he saw in the desert, but it really looks like a mother and child form there. And it looks so similar in a way to the Henry Moore sculpture next to it, this really early carving in English alabaster, where he's finding a figure, a form with just the hint of a head and these hands there. Weston finding a figure in the natural landscape, and Moore finding a figure in the stone. And there's a really lovely parallel there. In this gallery alongside the Hepworth sculpture, Barbara Hepworth was a contemporary of Henry Moore's and also made monumental bronze sculpture. Here at the center of the gallery is the largest exhibit, the largest object in the exhibition, a Henry Moore sculpture of a reclining figure. And I'll show it to you in more detail here. For Moore, this work was made in the late 1950s, early 1960s. The reclining figure is something that he returns to again and again. He is constantly inspired by the figure, the human form. And here, carving from a single piece of elm wood, he's punching it through, creating these holes, using a tool to chisel it, to find texture and on it, and to create this landscape within the body of the figure. It is just such a strikingly beautiful piece of material, really, to look at. And then the way he's transformed it, taking the natural form and creating this human figure out of it. If you're coming to the exhibition, I encourage you to look at it alongside the small wall next to it. You're seeing it just in the back of the photograph here. We call that our wall of wood. It shows Alexander Calder, another sculptor working in wood, an O'Keeffe work, some works by Edward and Brett Weston, and then the wonderful Arthur Dove pastel there that you can see, which is it's a tree trunk, but seen alongside Moore's reclining figure, I think we can start to see a figure in the trunk of Dove's work as well. So that's been really fun for us to find the connections between our own collection and these amazing loans that we have on display here in the Gund Gallery. So next, in the way the exhibition flows, we move into a space dedicated just to Moore, and then it's followed by a space dedicated just to O'Keeffe. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of biography about Henry Moore. He's born in Yorkshire in July of 1898. He's the son of a coal miner. He initially does a teacher training program that he graduates from in 1914. And then almost immediately enlists in the Civil Service Rifles and is sent off to the front in France and returns shortly after peace is declared. Off the back of that, he is able to go to the Leeds School of Art on an ex-serviceman's grant, and he's the first student of sculpture there. And he is omnivorous in the things that he looks to. He looks to African art, he looks to pre-Columbian art, he looks to Cycladic art. And I'm showing you here this really lovely sycamore wood head, one of his earliest known works here. And I think you can certainly see how he's indebted to African art at this early moment. After his initial training in Leeds, he moves down to the center of the art world, London, in the 1920s. And this very tender marble dog that I'm showing you here is exhibited in his first exhibition. It's a group exhibition held in London in 1924 with other students from the Leeds School, including Barbara Hepworth. And you can see how carving is very important for him at this early stage, both in wood and in stone here. As he moves into the 1930s, a bit more success comes his way. He has his first solo exhibition in London, and then he becomes the head of sculpture at the Chelsea School of Art, a major center for studying art in London, and he holds that post all the way up until the school closes for World War II. Here I'm showing you him directly carving a sculpture at his studio in Hampstead in North London, which was a kind of haven for artists. And he lived and worked there in Hampstead up until 1940. In 1940, in the fall, for 57 nights, Londoners experienced the Blitz, an unrelenting bombing, and many people went to the underground stations to seek shelter. Moore went to the underground tunnels, and he observed people there huddled in the tunnels, but he did not sketch out of respect for the people who were sheltering there. But when he came home, he started to make these haunting, really incredible drawings, which he started to exhibit in London in 1940 and 41. They gained some attention, particularly of an art critic, and he became an official war artist, and that really launched his career. These were some of the first works that made him really well known within England and then allowed him to gain further success. His studio was bombed nearby in 1940 in Hampstead, and so he moves out of London. He moves to Hampstead. He moves out from Hampstead to Hertfordshire, where he settles in a town called Perry Green outside the village of Much Haddam. It's only about 27 miles north of London, so he's still within touching distance there. The property was a collection of little buildings that he used for different parts of his artistic practice. And for those of you who've been to the exhibition, those who haven't, one of the wonderful things about this project is that we've collaborated with the Henry Moore Foundation and the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum to bring studio recreations for both artists to the Gund Gallery. And I'm showing you here the studio for Henry Moore, which is crammed full of things. It's his Born Maquette studio, where he used his collection of found objects, and where he also made his plaster maquettes that were the basis for his larger scale works. And within this studio space, you'll find a video of him at work, handling some of the very objects that are within it. And I think once you see O'Keeffe's studio, when in Erica's next portion, you'll see that they have very different personalities, and that shows in their studios. Moore is very eclectic. He's very sociable. He allows things to happen by chance. He's quite playful. There's plaster splattered all over the ground. When we get to O'Keeffe's, it's very different. I'm showing you here the actual studio in Perry Green, which is still completely crammed full of things, even when they took out what they sent to us here for the exhibition. And I love the view out the window here. These are the rolling English countryside hills outside his window, which had sheep that would walk through. And sometimes he would take his sculptures out into the landscape and site them there and observe the way they changed based off of what was behind them, or how the atmospheric conditions were changing as well. One of the wonderful things to think about with Moore is how he goes from really small scale objects to really large ones. He liked to say that you couldn't turn a large sculpture upside down to see the underside of it, but you could in a small scale. So he always worked in the plaster maquette, the small scale, and then would enlarge his works later on. I'll just say briefly that he had a very prodigious career as a draftsman. He made 9,000 drawings during his life. They were integral to his artistic practice, and we have with 5 of them on display in the exhibition. By the 1950s and 1960s, certainly, Moore was a household name. He was becoming very, very popular. His works were being commissioned by universities, governments, public groups, and starting to enter public plazas and spaces around the world, across Europe and across North America. In the exhibition, we have this incredible plaster working model called Atom Piece, which was a preparatory work for his well-known work, Nuclear Energy, at the University of Chicago. The final work is over 12 feet tall, and this was made to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the first nuclear fission achieved by Enrico Fermi there in 1942. And Moore drew on different types of symbolism for this work to create this very, very emotive and moving sculpture. Erica mentioned earlier the MFA's own head for the UNESCO reclining figure. I think you can see it here. This is a monumental work in travertine marble that was commissioned in the 1950s to go outside of the UNESCO headquarters, the body that protects World Heritage. And Moore went through lots of different ideas for a kind of figure. He wanted maybe someone reading a book to imply knowledge, but ultimately he went again for a reclining figure in a really beautiful striated travertine that he went to Italy to carve himself. And then in a nod to our Boston and Cambridge presence, I'm showing you here one of 2 works that are on the MIT campus. This is the working model for the reclining figure that is now at Lincoln Center. I'm showing it to you in 2 views here. By the 1960s, Moore was thinking about different ways to break the figure up into multiple pieces. He starts making 2-piece and 3-piece figures at this time. And when he received this commission, he knew that the sculpture would be displayed in a pool. And so he built a pond in his garden and made scaled mock-ups that he would place into the garden, which I think is really just such a commitment to his craft. By the 1970s, I think he was the 2nd highest taxpayer after Paul McCartney in the United Kingdom. So he's receiving major commissions, really very important, especially working with architects and citing his works alongside modern architecture. And you'll recognize the 3-piece vertebra that I showed that's in the first gallery of the exhibition. It's here blown up to its full size behind Moore and his fellow artist, I.M. Pei, the architect. And that sculpture is now outside the Dallas City Hall, and it's large enough that you can actually walk between the 2 pieces, which is really fun to think about when you see the sculpture in the galleries. And I'm going to turn it back over to Erica for a bit of O'Keeffe.
Thank you, Courtney. We'll meet O'Keeffe now after this deep dive into Henry Moore, and we'll start with her studio, which you see now on the left. And I think you'll all agree that it's just a little bit different than Henry Moore's. Moore was, as Courtney said, sort of a creative and excitable person, somebody who just tried different things, turned them upside down, picked up different things and stuck them together, always inspired to make different kinds of works of art. It was a more communal practice being a sculptor. He had studio assistants. And all of that is very, very different than the way O'Keeffe worked. You'll notice that we have videos in both of the studio reconstructions, Moore in his studio playing with things. O'Keeffe wouldn't let anybody show her at work. There aren't films of her painting. There aren't photographs of her painting. There are images of her in her studio, which allowed us to make this reconstruction, or rather the O'Keeffe Museum to help us make this reconstruction. But the video is quite different in that you never see O'Keeffe at work. This was her studio, her space, her place where she needed to be alone to make her works of art. It's very neat, very controlled in a way that I find quite similar to the way that she made her paintings. And you see a wall of them here on the right, made some of them at Ghost Ranch, the first of her 2 New Mexico studios, and the one that you see in our studio recreation. Ghost Ranch was a place that she first visited in 1934 and then bought one of the small houses there in 1940. She had a second home and studio in Abiquiu, New Mexico, where she moved permanently in 1949 after the death of her husband, Alfred Stieglitz. She said she bought it for the black door in the wall of the courtyard. And you can see in the paintings along the left side of the wall of paintings that she continued to explore how to paint that door. She said she never quite got it, but she always kept trying. I think her working method was extremely careful, disciplined, and almost fierce. Very different, I think, from Moore's messy playfulness. Could I have the next, please? It won't surprise you to hear that O'Keeffe was a very determined and strong woman, a woman experimental both in the choices she made about her life and the choices that she made about her work. She crafted a life for herself that put her own needs and her own art first. Next, please. O'Keeffe was born in Wisconsin in 1887. She was one of 7 children, and her parents were dairy farmers. You may know that her sister Ida, who you see here on the left in the portrait of the 3 little girls, was also a painter, and the MFA holds one of her works, the lighthouse picture that you see at lower left. Georgia studied art in Chicago first, and then she moved to New York. Next, please. In New York, she entered the classes at the Art Students League, and her professor was none other than William Merritt Chase, one of the leading Impressionist painters of the late 19th century and early 20th century, and a teacher who was especially respected for his belief in women's talents and in his offering a supportive education, not only for them to learn their craft, but also to succeed in the art world. I'm showing you a very early O'Keeffe at the bottom right of the rabbit and the copper pot. If I told you it was a work by William Merritt Chase, you'd probably believe me. And Chase did a lot of still lifes with different fishes and game and copper pots. But he also encouraged his students to find their own path. Could I have the next, please? And O'Keeffe found it quite quickly. After she studied with Chase, she became inspired by the lessons of Arthur Wesley Dow, a painter who lived in Ipswich, Massachusetts, and who in fact worked at the MFA as an adjunct curator of Japanese art. Dow was also an influential teacher, not only in terms of the classes that he taught in New York City, but also in his publications, most notably his book Composition, which was published in 1905, and you see it here at center. Dow taught the principles of Japanese design and composition, reducing what he saw in the world around him to the most elegant and simplified of forms. You can see how that affected O'Keeffe in this extremely early watercolor on the right of a lawn at the University of Virginia, where she was teaching and taking classes. You'd never guess it was an O'Keeffe, but you can see already that she's moved strongly away from chase and towards a more simplified abstract vision. Could I have the next, please? O'Keeffe moved to West Texas after that and began to teach art and to experiment with abstraction. She was inspired, she said, by a reproduction she saw of a work by Arthur Dove, which was similar to the one that you see on the left. Dove was one of the first American artists to experiment with this kind of abstraction, and eventually Dove and O'Keeffe became friends. The two O'Keeffes that you see on the right were made under the influence of that sort of abstraction. She called them her specials, and without her knowledge, one of her friends sent drawings like these to Alfred Stieglitz, an important dealer in New York. Could I have the next, please? Here you see Stieglitz in a self-portrait. He was an influential photographer, a promoter of the idea that photography could be a fine art rather than simply the device of a machine. He was a leading promoter of modernism of all kinds, a real impresario and an important gallerist. And you're seeing here on the right an exhibition of photography at one of his 3 successive galleries in New York. Stieglitz exhibited O'Keeffe's work in his gallery in 1917, and he convinced her to move to New York, promising her that her career would flourish. And yes, they began a passionate affair, and they would marry in 1924. Could I have the next, please? O'Keeffe had already begun to explore not only the appearance of things, but also the feelings that they evoke. First, in works she made in Texas, like the one on the left, Light Coming on the Plains, which really gives you the whole feel of the way light expands as the sun rises, especially in a place like West Texas, where the earth seems so flat and the sky so large. She also began to experiment with other kinds of abstraction. One of several artists who, inspired by the European artist Kandinsky, began to think about how sound might take on visual form. And she made a few paintings that were about music, like the one you see on the right-hand side. How does music look? What sounds do the colors make? Could I have the next, please? In the early 1920s, soon after these pure abstractions, O'Keeffe began to think about making abstractions from real objects. And among the first of these were her enlarged flowers, like the two you see here, which are both in the exhibition. She said that she wanted to surprise people into taking time to look, to see the world that she saw within the flower. If she painted them the size that they really are, she said, no one would pay any attention to them at all. They'd simply dismiss it as a pretty still life. But by enlarging the flowers and engaging you with their forms, the softness of their petals, their complicated interiors, the way one color seamlessly blends into the other, she felt that she could make you take time to really appreciate what they looked like. But she painted many different subjects at the same time. Could I have the next, please? In New York, living with Stieglitz in the Shelton apartment building, which you see on the left, She began to explore how New York's new skyscrapers looked and how they changed the skyscape that she saw in and around them, already experimenting with the negative space that surrounded these tall buildings and making them into distinct forms. She loved to see how they interacted with light, with the reflections that sunlight made on their glass windows, or how those glass windows glowed in the nighttime. She had started to visit New Mexico, but many of her earliest paintings that you might think were painted in the Southwest were actually made in New York, like the cow skull with calico roses that you see at the center. And you see O'Keeffe here in a Stieglitz photograph of her holding that very cow skull. And if you look carefully, you can see it mounted on a panel on the patio of their apartment on East 54th Street in New York. These early bone paintings were made in the city, and as she put it, she shipped back barrels and boxes of bones from New Mexico, composing them into art in New York. Next, please. O'Keeffe began to earn recognition for her art in the 1930s, and you see here a spread in Life magazine on Valentine's Day, 1938, that features one of these skull pictures with a pink rose on the right. It says O'Keeffe turns dead bones into live art. So Stieglitz's idea that if she came to New York, she would be at the center of the American art world really paid off. And she started to earn more and more attention and acclaim and sales during the 1930s. Also during the 30s, she first visited Ghost Ranch. Could I have the next, please? And here are two views of the buildings at Ghost Ranch, as you can see in the black and white photographs here, and also to remind you that our studio installation is based on the studio she used at Ghost Ranch. She first went there in 1934. It was a dude ranch, meaning a place where wealthy Easterners could come and play cowboy and pretend that they were living the Western life. She rented a small cottage there and began to paint. 3 years later, she bought a larger house on the Ghost Ranch property, and by 1940, she had purchased the house and used it for the rest of her life. Next, please. The subjects of her painting were all around her. If you turn around, like you saw in the photograph of me that was taken at Ghost Ranch, you can see the distinctive mountaintop, the mesa of the Pedernal, if you simply stand on the patio at Ghost Ranch. And you see that distinctive mountaintop in both the MFA's Deer Skull with Pedernal, which we've added to the exhibition, where it appears just at the bottom of the composition. And you see it too in Pedernal from the Ranch from 1956 on the right-hand side, where it appears as sort of a strange shape, haloed, isolated by the hole in a pelvis bone. O'Keeffe is now so identified with this mountain that has overshadowed the significance of this place and this land for the area's native inhabitants, their communities and art makers who had worked there for generations. And we have added 3 pieces of Southwest native pottery to the exhibition to ensure that their stories are represented as well. Next, please. O'Keeffe bought a second property in Abiquiu in 1945, and she moved there permanently after Stieglitz died in 1946, and she was able to settle his estate a few years later. As I said, she said that she bought the house for the black door of the patio, and you see it here on the right. And next slide, please. You can see how she painted it repeatedly. These 3 objects, all from the MFA's collection, are in the exhibition. a photograph that O'Keeffe took herself of this black door in the patio, and two views of it. At the bottom, the horizontal one is fairly realistic with a strip of sky at the top to orient you. In Patio with Black Door at the right, it becomes completely abstract, almost as if she were playing with forms that had nothing to do with actual architecture. It's an abstraction based completely on her house, but also completely seen in artistic and formal terms. O'Keeffe's homes and her surroundings inform her art in many ways. Could I have the next, please? The juxtapositions that she made, for example, between small objects and the landscape seem completely natural after you've been to her house. And I'm showing you here on the left two views of the home in Abiquiu, where inside and outside come together through open rooms with simply a loggia kind of roof, or the large picture windows that she had inserted into the adobe walls, bringing the outside in and the inside out. She arranged objects on the windowsills in her house, and you can see a snapshot I took of a ram's horn sitting on the windowsill with the landscape behind it, which I think shows you how natural those juxtapositions of near and far, like the one you see with the white shell and the red hill at the lower right, they seem so natural after you see how her careful arrangements were actually arrangements that she lived with. Next, please. O'Keeffe didn't just paint at home. She was an intrepid traveler. She learned to drive. She owned a Model A Ford, and she used it as a mobile studio. And one of her favorite places was a place she called the Black Place. And you see it here in 6 views. The top 3, banded in red, are in the exhibition. It's a part of New Mexico that's actually called the Beastie Badlands, a very interesting sedimentary landscape with different mineral deposits that give the layers of land different colors. O'Keeffe said it looked like a mile of elephants with sand at their feet. She repeated the motif in many compositions. Again, a realist one at the upper left, giving you a strip of sky, although not telling you very much about the scale of these enormous hills. But as you can see, as she works continuously on this motif, like Moore, iterating constantly, using the same object to make different kinds of works of art, they get more and more abstract, as you can see in the 3 at the bottom. Can I have the next, please? O'Keeffe exhibited often, not just in New York, but also in Chicago, and as you can see on the left, in Worcester, Massachusetts, where you see her in conversation with Bill Lane, a great collector of her work, who, as many of you may know, gave his collection to the MFA, and it's the strength of our American modernist holdings. But while she earned a certain amount of acclaim, it's really, I would say, with the rise of the women's movement in the 1970s, that she at last achieves the real public acknowledgement and fame. You can see her here now on the cover of Life magazine, and she lived to see it. Next, please. Now that we've gotten to know both Moore and O'Keeffe through their biographies and also through their studios, we'll come back to the last 3 galleries of the exhibition, which we thought of really as one gallery with 3 different sections. And you see it here from beginning with this beautiful bronze Moor at the center of this slide, all the way to the O'Keeffe pelvis that you can see that blue dot at the far end. I'd like to close our time together by bringing you back into the MFA, into those galleries, and into conversation with O'Keeffe and Moore. These are visual spaces where these artists' works rhyme together in galleries that are devoted first to balance, as you can see here, with objects that might have 2 points or 2 halves, or simply are arranged in harmony with one another. Next, please. To a gallery devoted to looking within, where the flower pictures are, where you look inside things and find the mysteries within them. One of my favorite comparisons in this show is this rust and green colored O'Keeffe of autumn leaves and a pile. You can see down through the various layers of leaves, finding different shapes and colors as you move down through them, juxtaposed with this beautiful Henry Moore, almost in the same tonality of green, that has a helmet shape on the outside, but inside is full of life and bursting forms. To the last gallery of the exhibition, which you see here, which we've devoted to looking through things, the attention that both Moore and O'Keeffe paid, not only to the objects that they found in nature, but to how those objects interacted with the world around them. What you would see through those penetrating holes in the Moore reclining figure that you see on the right-hand side. So abstract, but interacting with the spaces behind it. Or in O'Keeffe's wonderful pelvis number 4, which you see at the center of this wall of bone pictures, the main subject is really beyond the pelvis, into the sky beyond, and the moon that you can see through it, echoing the shapes. I'd like to close this presentation before we take questions with my favorite O'Keeffe quote, which is, "To see takes time." And I hope together with Courtney that each of you might find the time to come see this beautiful exhibition, which is on view at the MFA through January 20th. It bears taking time to see. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica and Courtney. We do have some time for questions, so I will just remind everybody, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function on the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we will get to as many as we have time for. And we do have one, and actually, Erica, I think you touched on it a tiny bit at the very end of your portion on O'Keeffe, but having spent so much time with George O'Keeffe and with Henry Moore, and having the benefit of some video content, is there any way, or is there a particular way that they describe their own work that stuck with you as you were thinking about how to put together this exhibition?
I think I've given mine already, which
Yeah,
the
probably.
word that stays with me is that to see takes time. And that's one of the wonderful things that I find about looking at art, that the more you look, the more you see. And I think O'Keeffe was encouraging that. And I think I'll let Courtney talk about it if she wants to, but we've tried to encourage that within the exhibition itself.
Yes, and I think if I had to say it for Moore in a way, I would say it's that he's just constantly inspired by everything around him, and he's inspired by it again and again in different ways. So he could find a found object and use it in one way, and in the next work he'd invert it the other way, or press it into a piece of clay to get the inverse. And I alluded to that when talking about his studio, that he is quite playful and leaves things up to chance quite a bit. And I think when working in 3 dimensions, that's so much a part of being a sculptor, is finding a way to make a 3-dimensional shape that has these forms that you can continue to read in different ways and continue to be a source of inspiration.
I would
Terrific.
just quickly add that we do have a slow looking feature on the audio guide in the exhibition to encourage people to take time to see and to see how Moore and is turning things in space and using the same shell, for example, to make different pieces of sculpture with. We work together with colleagues at Brigham and Women's Hospital who have a program to teach people how to look, something we want all our physicians to know how to do.
That's a great point. We do have another question. It's an interesting question. If you had to imagine a conversation between these two artists, what would you imagine that conversation would, what would they be talking about? What might they have to share with one another?
Oof.
I know, that's a tough one.
That's an amazingly great question, I have to
Yeah.
say.
I haven't thought about it. That's funny.
Well, we think they may never have met, but I have this fantasy that one of them was in the buffet line at MoMA's cocktail reception in 1946, and maybe they bumped into each other. I know that O'Keeffe would have been aware of Moore. I hope that Moore would have been aware of O'Keeffe. My impression of him is that he's a very friendly person, a gentleman, somebody who would have taken an interest in, asked her perhaps about her work. Courtney?
I think that's true. I can picture them sitting maybe together in his living room, looking at his collection of objects. But I think they would also have been so different. I think he's quite outgoing and kind of almost bumbling in a way, and whereas I imagine her kind of restrained. So I think you're right. He probably would have asked the first question, and hopefully would have asked her about her work, and then it would have unfolded from there.
I think you're right. Yeah. Lots of comments coming in about the wonderful presentation. So I want to make sure that you that you hear that as well. But we do have another question. Did creating this exhibition change your view of either artist in a significant way, or did it more support what you already sort of thought about these two artists?
I'll say that visiting Henry Moore's studio in Perry Green was transformational for the way we thought about this exhibition. We'd been starting to see his works on the checklist and in books and in reproduction, but going to the place where they're kind of the keepers of his legacy, it's where he worked and exhibited his work for so long. We had a chance to meet one of the conservators there who actually, as a young boy, while Moore was still alive, lived on the property and used to climb over the sculptures that he now takes care of. So there's a really lovely through line from that knowledge of knowing the actual person and then through and having that person be the one telling us about the sculptures and telling us about how we can start to read Moore's language of forms. That for me was a really, really eye-opening experience.
It's great.
I feel like most of what I learned was also about Henry Moore, since I was less familiar with him. I'd seen his work my whole life at Lincoln Center and the National Gallery and all the places, public places where it exists. But I think what inspired me about doing this exhibition was the idea that here are two amazing artists who were so aware of their natural surroundings and found art in it. And it gave me sort of a wonderful feeling about how, in a way, we can all find that. We can all experience our environment and take aesthetic pleasure in it. Maybe we can't all paint or sculpt, but I think the idea that art is really all around us is something that I took away from the combination of these two artists.
Great. Maybe another tough question, but a good question. If somebody were to bring a visitor to this exhibition at the MFA and could only show them 5 objects, which 5? So it's sort of like if you had to create a mini highlight, I suppose, what 5 objects would you encourage somebody to make sure they don't miss?
Can it be 5 pairings?
That's what I was going to say.
Certainly, I think so. I almost think it has to be, right?
Yes.
Because I absolutely the first comparison that Courtney showed of the Moore figure knife edge and the O'Keeffe red tree yellow sky, I think incorporates so much of what the exhibition is about, both in terms of making and inspiration and the formal techniques that both artists used. So that would definitely be on my list.
As would the one that you concluded with, the pelvis and the reclining figure bone. That's the cover of the catalog. I think that one exemplifies it so beautifully. Again, they're doing something so similar, but they're an ocean apart, and they both have this beautiful sort of ethereal quality to them. I would say that would also be one of my top pairings. So that's at least one at the start and one at the end.
And the two in the middle would be the studios, the two
Yes.
studios. It's very unusual for us to be able to show an artist's workplace in the context of the exhibition. And I think you learn a whole lot about both of them from seeing those studio setups. So that's 4 things. That's not bad.
I think they're great. I think the studio settings too really they do give you a sense that the artist almost just walked away, right? And that you sort of just missed them. So I think those spaces are particularly interesting too. Well, we have a couple more questions, maybe we have time for a couple more. This one is about O'Keeffe. Was O'Keeffe interested in current world events, or was she more focused on the environment? Did anything else sort of work its way in?
It's another wonderful question, and I would say that the kind of work on that about O'Keeffe has been fairly recent, and I think quite eye-opening. Recent scholars have taken a look at O'Keeffe's work from the 40s during the war years, and have really paid attention to how they reflect a particular time. O'Keeffe does talk a little bit about it. The pelvis picture that we keep talking about and showing, she said that for her, it showed that there was sort of hope after people stopped with this destructive moment that they were in. That, you know, when man stopped being at war, that she found that view of the sky to be hopeful. Another recent article I read was about the Black Place paintings, which, as you saw, get progressively more abstract, but also more jagged and dark. And those have been read in the context of World War II as well. O'Keeffe's home in Abiquiu is not that far from Los Alamos, as a matter of fact. So she was definitely aware of what was going on. And I found out she even went to a musical concert at Los Alamos. Something to
Really?
keep the scientists entertained, I guess.
Great. Perhaps we have time for one last question, and it's a question about traveling exhibitions in general. Is it typical for traveling art exhibitions to change from venue to venue?
Having done a number of them myself, I'll take that question.
Sure.
Yes and no. We all have different spaces and different audiences, and we know how those spaces work and what our audiences expect of us. So there are often changes to the interpretation, somewhat to the gallery layout. Sometimes works don't travel to every venue of an exhibition, and so we make substitutions at different venues.
Mhm.
Some organizers control it to the point where you're not allowed to make changes to the exhibition. Others, like San Diego, simply wanted to approve the changes that we made, and they very generously allowed us to make the changes in the show and to make additions to it from our own collection. Um, as an organizer myself, I feel like it's not up to me to control somebody else's display. And so I can just say that the Sargent exhibition in Boston looked very different when it was in London at the Tate. So yes, there are often changes from venue to venue, and it's really fun actually to see how a show changes from place to place.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you again, Erica and Courtney, for a really fascinating look at these two artists. And I want to encourage everybody at home joining us, if you have not seen this exhibition in person and you are able to in its closing weeks, I really encourage you to come and see it because the juxtaposition of these two artists is really striking, both in pictures, but even more so when you are standing in the same room. So I encourage you to come. And I want to thank you all again for joining us tonight. And we look forward to welcoming you in person at the museum again very soon. So thank you all again for joining us.
Thank you.